Hello, everyone. How are you guys? Let's see,
Hi.
Adriana. Hi, Adriana. How are
Great. Good morning.
you? Good morning, Jose. How are you? Norma is also here. We have us a little small group. Let me start some recording.
Recording in progress.
I'm looking through the pathology projects, and I'm very pleased with a lot of you guys. I'm really happy with all the work you're doing. How is it feeling for you doing the project? Is it all right, or is it Uh, you need more help, or how are you feeling about it? Any questions?
Yeah, I do have a question.
Hmm.
Um, for the draft,
Yeah.
what do you expect? Is it going to be just like a lot of information, or is it just going to be a document, recording?
No, I expect basically a presentation draft of what you're gonna do, then use your first sort of draft that you want to use, then to make the voiceover video. And so
Okay,
um,
got it.
I like to, you're looking at like a 2 to 3 minute type video, of course. At the end, it's some not too much, but also not too little. So my um, like the process of explaining something can be a bit of a challenge, right? So the first thing is you gather information of your own, and then you sieve through them, and you try to not use full sentences on a presentation, more like bullet points with the main points highlight or written out, that then when you present you have some guide of how to talk about it, so that way you're not just reading a text, because that's if you read the text, everybody's just going to fall asleep. I've learned that plenty of times, believe me. And then the other thing you're going to do is add a lot of pictures, or at least that's what I do in a presentation, because then when you present it, you make a voiceover. That's going to be then, next week we have a couple of weeks to make that voiceover. This week we kind of go back and forth a little, like give you some feedback, and then you do a little more work, and then by next week we have something together that is hopefully fairly easy for you then to talk about in a voiceover video. um, so it's a mixture between text and visualizations, and as a for you to make it is that process of gathering information and then extracting the information and in and wording it in a way that then you can explain it. And that's the challenge really in a presentation, is how do you explain something, or how do we explain something to somebody else. And in explaining, it's kind of, we want to make it as simple as possible, like Einstein said, explain something as simple as possible but not simpler than that. And that's the challenge. So you use um, I'm trying to do that all the time, and obviously, as you know, sometimes I fail, sometimes it works out. But you want to go into enough detail of fundamentally explaining something, like for example, how does a medication work? Not just say like, well, this medication is for that, but also a little bit of the physiology. What does it affect? Or if you look at a disease process, do a little bit of the explain what the disease is about, who gets it, and what the demographics are, and what causes it. But when you go into like what causes it, you want to give them give the listener as much detail as possible to preserve the big picture. So be that's sort of the challenge with making a presentation. I'm going to try to guide you through that process a little bit, because it's also very nice if you can create something that you can explain to other people. Sort of a little bit of a craft. And I figure I've done it so many years now, I might just at least give some of you a few tips of making, because as we go through college, we just got to make these kind of things over time. Is that helpful,
I,
or Adriana?
yeah, that's helpful.
That's good.
I have another question about that.
Yeah.
Like for our group is gathering information right now, and I have the question alternative invention or
Hmm.
interventions
Hmm.
and lifestyle changes.
Hmm.
So I would gather the information and then submit like my assigned question as like
You
a
can, yeah.
presentation slide. Is
Hmm.
that correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
You can also do it
awesome.
as a group already. People do it. I mean, ultimately, if we do the presentation is one group makes the presentation at the end, the video presentation. That's the group itself. So it's a cohesive, sort of a cohesive. So you do want to work together. Sometimes it's hard to make a presentation as a shared document, or I'm having a hard time opening some of the Google slides right now. So I'm really sorry. I got to go deeper into that and figure out what the problem is. Um, um, but if you make and but you don't have to do it as a group. As the written part, you can work on that individually. Just make sure it doesn't look completely different than the other ones, and so make sure you do work together as a group. Ultimately, because the video will be one video per group.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you.
Yes. Anybody else on that topic?
I
Jessica?
I actually had a quick question.
Yes.
So for my draft, I know we were having problems with you opening mine.
Yes, so far.
But I accidentally, well, I put a lot of writing and pictures in mine. And so I don't know if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, it's a draft, right? So now you put something down, and what I do when I create something, I have to make a draft and then sleep on it a couple times and then read it again, and then new ideas come in, and then work that back and forth for a few times, and then the draft becomes then the product. And so that's totally okay. You're probably gonna, when you go through it, if you have a lot of text, then you're probably gonna take the buts and ifs out and just leave the most important part. So when you make a video, or in a classroom, then you're not just end up reading the text. Or what happens to me, if there's too much text, I forget where I'm at in the conversation, and I can't catch it anymore. And so it's easier to just have bullet point type ideas, and then if they're visualized with pictures, then it makes it easier to talk about them, and the audience has an easier time to follow, because a visual is so much more than a word, for us, especially with our groups, that we have so many ESL students, or me included, that visuals are much easier to understand, especially when we come from different walks of different parts of the world, and some words might mean a little bit of different in different for different people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Good, yeah. No, you guys are doing great work. I mean, I didn't see you yet, but I'm sure you're doing great work too. I'm sure I will see it in a little bit. Anybody else on that, or if not, I just keep going and keep going through them, and then the other thing with the presentation that's cool, when you talk about something, if you can make a personal connection, like a story about it, then that's a really good way to make the audience want to pay attention, and not it doesn't get boring when it's personalized, or much less so. I mean, not that you guys are boring at all. I'm just trying to prevent that. Since often it's hard to listen to somebody, and the more personable it is, the easier. So let me go through. If you're good with that, let me go through what we're doing this week. What we're doing this week. Let me go through the week first. I think we're just doing not just, that's a big topic, but I think this week we're doing the brain. Can you see my presentation? Or my week, our week? So we're gonna have this week. We're gonna talk about the brain. Have some questions about the brain. Do some labeling. Spend a little time on the labeling. This terminology here gets a little bit more again. We have a few. These are the terms we're using on that. Mostly when we talk about the brain is kind of a complicated topic, because it's hard to study the brain. It's hard to study itself, our brain having to study the brain. So it gets a little difficult. And what the difficulties are with the brain is mostly that we just don't necessarily understand that much about it. I mean, we do, but we have a lot of open questions, so it's less easy that way than a heart that we understand much more. So when we talk about the brain, let me actually just go to it. Hold on. We have a lot of structures that we know, and we know what they do, but they're not necessarily all that cohesively making a whole story like we have in the heart. And so as we go through the brain, we first discussed the fundamentals. We briefly talked about that, the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, the computer versus the cables. We talk about the basic functioning here again, where this is a negative feedback loop basically, where we have a receptor detecting something, and the brain is the control organ. So it sends a stimulus to that brain, say, hey, something's going on. The temperature is really warm on the skin, and it's going to fry and burn. So then we have the brain thinks about it, and integrates the info and sends a signal to the effector organs, and mostly that's a muscle in this instance, but it can also be a nerve, another neuron, or a gland. And if like the temperature gets too hot in the stove or so, we'll pull it away, and then that's that feedback receptor input, processing, effector output, and then a reaction. And so that's fundamentally how the brain works. And then this we can go through. Oh, and then when we, this is actually a really good slide. So we have the central nervous here, and then we more go into talking about the cables. These are all the cables, the peripheral nervous systems. But when we look at the cables and we dissect the cables, we have that sensory component that brings information into the brain that then can be communicated or can be integrated. But we also have that motor output, the effector organs that then do the, up here we talked about, do the effect on, like we pull the hand away or so. And then when we look at that, we have multiple different divisions of that nerve. We have some things like we want to walk somewhere. That's a voluntary situation. We can decide what we want to do, but then we have a lot of processes that are automatic. They're autonomic. We don't think about them; they just happen. They're involuntary, and then those are described in an autonomic nervous system, which we will touch later on. You probably heard before of the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight versus the parasympathetic nervous system. One of them, the sympathetic nervous system, fundamentally uses the body systems in an emergency situation. It applies the muscles. It can run away from a lion or so. It's when you go on the freeway and you get caught up by some jerk and you really swerve over, then that's that sympathetic response that we get to really, it's an emergency situation. And then we need to have an opposite of that as an extreme. Most of the time we're in between those two, but that's the extreme side. The opposite is where we're conserving energy on one hand, but we're also rebuilding the body's resources that we can then use in a sympathetic situation, in an action situation. And so we actually have a whole chapter that goes into that coming up at the not the brain. I think next week we're going to touch on that. So that's just overarching how the nervous system is structured. And then when we get through it, we start here some discussion we're going to have on the protection of the brain, because and the spinal cord too. These protections go for both the brain and the spinal cord, because the brain is very, very delicate. It's very soft. If you hold a live brain in your hand, it will collapse. You need to have it be in liquid. It needs to be weightless, and the body creates that weightless situation by having multiple protective layers, one right on top of it, and then has a gap, and then a couple more layers. The further out we go, usually when we have protective layers, the innermost ones are delicate, and then we get into the outermost are like leathery and tough and protective, physically that way. And in the brain, that uniqueness is that we have a film, a space in between the outer layers and the inner layers of the protection, and inside that space we have fluid, and it's called the cerebral spinal fluid, and that basically essentially makes the brain be weightless, and it's like in liquid, and so that helps the brain not to collapse under gravity and makes it be able to function. The reason, well, I don't know if the reason, but one of the great things about the brain being so flexible is the fact that it's very plastic, it's molding. We can create neural connections. The nerves can grow in that medium. It's much softer than like a muscle, let's say. A nerve could never grow in a muscle. But when we learn, like what we're doing right now, neurons are connected to other neurons that make thought. And then the more we study, for example, those neural connections get stronger and stronger by sending links back to the previous neurons and having sort of what they call a reverberating circuit. We briefly talked about that when it comes to the flashcards. But that, of course, needs a medium that is soft and moldable and growable. And that's what the brain is. It's a really cool construction that way. There's a brief discussion about the development of the brain. Basically, we have a long cord, and then as we grow, the brain becomes bigger and starts growing bigger and bigger, and these different vesicles start growing. We're not really going too much into detail of that, but just fundamentally, how when we start growing as a can't call as a few cells coming together. At some point, we're looking kind of like a leaf, like flat with the top and the bottom and the stem in between. And the stem in between is that neural canal that's getting created. And so first we have that leaf, and then part the central part folds inside and and then clips off and makes this neural canal that then becomes the spinal cord, and then that's then that stem of the leaf, so to speak, and then from there everything starts growing. The nervous system is one of the systems that has to grow very early because it's coordinating the growth of the embryo. So that's very important. Um, Interesting in this discussion is also where we can sort of see that the nerve cells and the skin cells have a common origin. So there that because we don't really have that discussion too much, but if you come across that later on at some point in your studies, this is where that starts as the origin. Interestingly, here also is that the brain has. Do you see me here? Yeah, good. The brain has its final weight, or almost its final weight, um, um, at age 5 to 7 years of age. So it's really an organ that grows very heavily at first, in the beginning. And so that's why the kids have a very big head compared to their whole body. And that's why it has to be already accommodating a large brain early on. And then from there, we pretty much go into discussion of the cerebrum. And the cerebrum is sort of the outer most layer of the brain that we can then describe different functions to. And that's where it gets a little bit chopped off. It's a little bit like the endocrine system. You have a gland and then you know what it kind of does, but it's not a whole story. All it's information pieces, because it is so complicated. And the other thing that's interesting about the brain, there's a book called The Holographic Universe, and it's by Michael Talbot, and they did studies in there where they showed that the brain can mirror functions to other parts of the brain if those functions are if the brain is available in that area. And let's say somebody is blind and we don't need the occipital cortex that much because we don't see, we can then use that part of the brain for other things in the body. The body really tries to be optimized, and then those people have much more tactile abilities, and can see with their hands, kind of thing, almost. And so that's really interesting about the brain. And I'm sure that's partly why it's so complicated. There's a lot of really cool stuff out there on that. The brain, the cerebrum, has an outer layer that's gray matter, they call it. It looks a little darker than the inside part. And what that represents is that the outside, the gray matter, has cell bodies. They are cell bodies, which are then becoming decision making, impulse initiating areas. As you remember, the neuron itself, it has that cell body, and then it has a extension on one side and a lot of dendrites on the other side, and axon and dendrites. But the impulse that the nerve impulse goes down an axon, that happens at the axon hillock, right at the end of that body to axon connection. So that's where the decision making is happening, is in the gray matter. And then the white matter are basically what we see when we call it white. These are the fat wrappings that go around the axon that insulate it, that make, on one hand, the impulse go much faster, but on the other hand, we don't, we want a boundary. We need to have an isolation that one neuron doesn't cross over to another neuron when the electricity fires. And so that whiteness is visible as those axons, that fat is visible as white, and we call them white matter. Then deep inside the brain structure, we do have other darker areas. Here they color them. They're not colored like that. I mean, maybe a little huey, that it looks a little more reddish or so. And those are collections of cell bodies inside the white matter, the white structure. And those are also nuclei. So when you see that gray description, gray nuclei, then you know gray means cell body in the brain. Well, it means it also in the spinal cord. A nuclei is a term we use of a collection of cell bodies inside the brain, as well as the spinal cord, inside the central nervous system. We use another term called ganglia, Ganglia, ganglia. And we'll talk about that in a couple, maybe next week, I think, in the spinal cord, yes. Because those are the same things, collections of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system, outside of the central nervous system. That's just an aside. I'm talking about that more when we talk about the spinal cord. Terminology. Then another aspect to the brain that's really crucial is the fact, the fibers, those white matters, the connections. And when we talk about fibers, we talk about these axons. We talk about connections between neurons and other neurons, or areas of the brain to other areas of the brain. And we got a few that we highlight, or a few categories, kind of. One is fibers that go from side to side of the brain, between the brain hemispheres. The two brain hemispheres are sort of helping each other out. We often talk about the math brain, the language brain, the creative brain, and the left brain, right brain. Loosely speaking, some of that is accurate. Some of the brain is more looking into the vision, into the concepts, and then other brain parts are more organizationally and making it happen. And so organizationally involved and make it happen. So there is differences, but we cannot be just using them as excuse that we're not good at math or language. That's just kind of not happening that way. We used to do that as kids when we weren't good at math or language. Like, well, I'm not a good right or left brainer, but that's not the reality, really. So those fibers that go from side to side, they're known as commissural fibers, and as we go through them, you will learn that more. Then we have fibers that go within the same area of the brain. They go from region to region. And then we also have fibers that go from the spinal cord up to the brain or back down. The pathways go both ways. And so we know in the brain, very important is that these fibers work. And so, for example, if we get dementia, one of the things that's happening is that the fiber connections decrease, and we have memory, but we have it stored somewhere, but we can't find it anymore. And so that's part of what the challenge is. So these fibers are as important as the neurons themselves. Oh, look, here we talk about that a little bit. I like that picture, of course. And then the other thing here, you probably have wondered, what are these wiggles called? The brain has wiggles and little divots, and then it has also deep divots that go deep down. There's actually one between the right and the left side of the brain. It goes all the way down, and you can split the brain apart. So the right and left hemisphere are really separated, are different. They're connected at the bottom of that where that corpus callosum is, which is really interesting. That's the one thing that they say, that the woman has a much bigger side to side connection between the female brain, between right and left hemisphere. God, I'm even going to probably get in trouble saying that word like that. And the male brain, by birth brain, has a much smaller one, and so that's why uh, uh, we ascribe more of a multitasky type, being able to do more things at once, in a female by birth or at birth brain versus a male at birth kind of brain. But some of that science is probably a little shady, but it's always. But there's some truth to that, apparently, some anatomical differences. So the hills are the gyri, and the little valleys are the sulci. They call them sulcus if one, sulci if plural, and then the deep ones are fissures. And so you'll get exposed to those as you go through, as the terms go. And then from here we go through the different parts of the brain. I go through the. Oh, and this is where it's kind of cool, because when you look at the cerebrum, the main outer part of the brain, you name them pretty much the way that the skull plates are named. So we have a frontal cortex, we have a parietal cortex, we have an occipital cortex, we have a temporal cortex, or two temporal cortices. And then inside them we talk a little bit about specifics, what they are ascribed to, what functions ascribed to, and a few areas potentially that are interesting, like for example in we have Broca's area, which is the speech creation, which is an area that's often affected by stroke. So when people can't verbalize but they can understand, which is very frustrating. And they actually have shown that if you play children's songs, the songs that that person liked to listen as a child, then you can sort of wake up some other area called Wernicke's area, which is usually just in understanding language, but it can be used slowly to also have some fundamental language creation. And so some of that stuff is really kind of cool. So we'll touch on a few of those things here and there, go through that, parietal, then different, we say different cortices. That's a cortex is a main area. Or when we look at a cortex, we're talking about an area with a specific function. So uh, uh, a lobe, a parietal lobe, for example, can have multiple different um, main areas. So we have, for example, a gustatory cortex is where we experience taste, and that's right in here in the temporal lobe. Or we have the visual cortex, and that's where we see, that's in the back. And when we go to that discussion, what's interesting, the function discussion also, we have a primary area, and that's sort of where we either initially receive an impulse if it's a sensation, or we send an impulse away and off if it's a, like say we have to talk to a muscle to walk somewhere. And that's a primary area, sort of the first or last place. And then we have a lot of around that area, we have association areas, and those are called association areas, but they're helping in processing the information. Like, what does it mean that I see this face, for example? Do I know this face? Is this face I should be friendly to? That kind of stuff happens then in the association areas, the interpretation and the processing. So that's kind of a cool concept too. And then the brain has it has a hidden lobe. So we'll talk about that briefly. It has one more lobe behind the temporal lobe called the insula. So that's an extra part that we don't have a skull plate to, because we don't have a skull inside there. So you go through that a little, and then that's the cortex. And then once we leave the outer shell, kind of, we go towards the inner parts of the brain. And developmentally, we then go more into the unconscious aspects of it, into the for example, a basal ganglia, which this is a wrong term, should be called basal nuclei because it's a cell body inside the central nervous system. A ganglia is outside. This is a good example that, in anatomy, things aren't really the laws of those words, they can change, so you always have exceptions. But a basal ganglia is an interesting one because it's a part of the brain that we store learned movement patterns. So if you're learning to drive, first you got to really concentrate and make sure, and at some point, it just clicks and we can kind of do it automatic. That automation is in that area, stored in that area. So that's kind of cool. That is actually why practice makes permanent, not perfect. I mean, unless you really learn it perfect at first, but the brain learns repetition and motions that way. There's one argument for learning it right the first time, so you don't have to unlearn it and then relearn it. So this is so we have a few of those areas. So the globus, the basal ganglia is kind of cool, and then we talk about the different pathways here. We talk about the olfactory also. That's a very important part because that's connected to the limbic system. And we'll talk a bunch about that because that's the emotional brain, the affective brain. How do we feel? It's like we often ascribe the forehead, the frontal cortex, to the thinking, the reasoning, the decisions, and then we say, oh, we should be doing that, and then the limbic system says, well, but I don't feel like it, and then that's the procrastination. So we'll talk a little bit about that in there to kind of understand better of how procrastination works, or how a temper tantrum works. That's what we have here in the amygdala hijack. So that's kind of a cool place. So those are areas deeper inside the brain. Again, they're not necessarily conscious, they're more subconscious behavioral things. And then more limbic system. Of course, I like the limbic system. And then another area that's interesting is I call that the diencephalon. When you look at the outer shell, the cortex here, those lobes, right here at the bottom center is this like almond shaped type, maybe egg shape, a little bigger than almond. Uh, with the shell, it's about the same size. And that area is also interesting because that's sort of the connection between conscious and unconscious, and it's a relay place where all the information that comes into the body gets filtered and say, oh, that needs to go to that part of the brain, that needs to go to that part of the brain, and so forth. So that's an interesting part. So, and then attached to that are a couple structures in the vicinity, and one is that hypothalamus. And the interesting, cool thing about the hypothalamus is that has a lot of connections then to the endocrine system, and so we have the psychology, the brain connection to the body function. So that would be where we have some psychosomatic illness, where if you're always a stressed out person and you're pissing off everything and you think you got the right for everything, you're probably going to get high blood pressure. And that's what happens there because the brain gets overstimulated, and then it talks to the body and says, listen, if this is like the situation, your body needs to be ready to fight every single moment. And over time, that's very stressful for the body. And so that's where we get these visceral diseases coming from a emotional, unrelenting emotional stressors. So that's kind of cool to understand. And of course, the other thing is the hypothalamus will be very important in thinking about all the functions it does. It's a very important structure. So I don't make you memorize all these lists. You got that by now, right? I want you to understand these things as much as possible, and then we can look up where the list is. I'm not a good memorization person that way, so I don't expect you to be. Good. And then this discussion here is also interesting. I talked briefly about the surrounding of the brain, the liquid that makes it weightless. We also have chambers inside the brain that are filled with that cerebrospinal fluid, that liquid, because besides making the brain weightless, and you see that here in this buoyancy question, Like if you don't have cerebrospinal fluid around it, the brain shrinks and it collapses, and it's very painful. Sometimes when we have birth to the baby and there's an epidural involved, uh, that goes into that space, that area in here, right in between here, except in the spinal cord. But the hole that the needle makes, doesn't close, and then it leaks out. And sometimes, very rarely, women who just gave birth have that problem and need to lay flat and can't be really sitting up or standing up, because that makes, that everything goes down, and then that draws all the blood, all the liquid down that is still in there potentially. So that's where you can see that in a pathology process, that concept, that situation. But anyway, the other thing, besides making the brain weightless, that cerebrospinal does, it also nurtures the brain. It gives it nutrients. Oh yeah, see, here's that. This is a lumbar puncture is sort of the epidural place. They go below L2. They have to go in L1, L2. And then there's a few more structures that I want to point out. We don't have to talk about them now. The reticular formation is kind of cool. That has to do with being alert, conscious versus asleep. So there is actually a mechanism that decides when we're asleep that maybe we don't need to have all the information going up to the brain. So it stops it and blocks a lot of information going into the brain, so we can have a rest, the brain can rest. And I think one of the aspects that they're talking about, thinking about, I'm not sure where it's at in the research, the Alzheimer's group can tell me that, is that sleep has a lot of effect on the brain long term. Obviously, we see that short term, we're too tired, but also long term, the brain cleans its pathways, kind of things. When we sleep, it shrinks a little bit. So apparently, so that's interesting. So make sure you get enough sleep. And what is enough sleep? Anybody know?
Like 8 hours a day
Yeah,
or a night?
I think that's the main. I
Heard
think
of 8 to 10.
Yeah, and then I heard that too. And then the other one I heard is 7 to 9. Sort of, yeah. So make sure you get like more than 7 if you can handle it. And of course, that excludes you if you have small kids. I'm sorry about that. That's hopefully just a temporary thing. But yeah, sleep is, and then the sleep cycle is the other thing that's important, and that's about a 90-minute sleep cycle. So when I had to study hard, I tried to do like sleep, not 3, but 6 hours or 7.5 hours, or sort of. And I think, to me, that I played with that in my 20s. It ended up being what makes me wake up really sleepy or kind of rested. Like, when we get woken up, if it's an alarm clock, sometimes it's like the groggy when you're in a deep sleep. And so that's that discussion. So the 90-minute cycle is also important, to have full cycles, so the brain really goes through different stages in those cycles. Anyhow, and then we finish up once we. Oh, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a little brain back here below the big brain, and the cerebellum helps us with balancing. So if you walk and there's a pothole and you don't see it, and you walk into that damn thing, there's a very good chance you can balance yourself out of it because of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum has these balancing things in it. It's also interesting, now more about it, that it has takes part in planning and in decision making more than we thought initially. The cerebellum is very interesting. It's a fairly small structure, but I think it has as many neurons as the upper part has, the main brain has. So it's a very, very, I have a feeling we will learn much more about the importance of the cerebellum as we go along in the studies. And we don't know yet. And then below, and then the cerebellum's here, and then the deep, deep inside structures in here are known as the midbrain, the pons, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. These are actually kind of a good. Then this pink one is the thalamus. That's that diencephalon, that in between structure. But this is actually good to color these like that, because that sort of tells us the delineation of these structures, because you can't really make them out on the real brain. It just is kind of like one long thing. It's not that easy to make out. But in these areas, we have the sort of fundamental functioning structures like heart rate and modification, breathing rate, and that kind of stuff in there. The really visceral, deep things that we don't think about at all. Um, and evolutionarily speaking, it's also the oldest part of the brain. These fundamental structures, and then the newer ones came evolutionarily later. Anyway, so that's kind of an overview of the brain. Is that how you're feeling about that?
It's really interesting.
It is, right? I think it's cool. Yeah, take some time, just and try to. I mean, of course, I'm talking about try to enjoy it. It's a freaking class, but as much as you can, appreciate. Maybe the word appreciate is more appropriate. But that's partly why I want to structure it to, always make sure you look at the review before or while you do the studies. Look at the review of the test. So if because if you get overwhelmed, then you can at least you can go. Not that you should be overwhelmed. Why am I implying that? But you can have a guide of make sure the bullet points you kind of understand um, for sure, and reach out if you don't, and if not, everything makes full sense. I think that's good. Any questions? No.
Not right now.
No.
Good. That way I was even really clear, or I'm just already so tired that I made no sense at all. Huh?
Wait, not about the lesson, but is the presentation, was it like 10 to 15 minutes?
Your presentations?
Yes.
Individually, each person, I like to aim for about 2 to 3 minutes, which ends up being 3 to 4 minutes. Do not feel bad about that, because but make sure it's still detailed enough. 2 to 3 minutes, about 20, 30 ideas, points, probably. And then as an entirety, I think below 10 minutes would be ideal. But often we go between the 10 to 15. Yeah. And that's totally
Okay,
good.
I'm doing it by myself. That's why I was just asking.
Oh, yeah, and yeah, I know I need to reach out. There's a couple of you who do it by yourself, so I need to make sure I reach out to you guys. You do, Sujata, you do it by yourself? Sujata?
Yeah, because there wasn't anyone else who was interested in
that's right.
osteoporosis, so I ended up doing it on my own, which is fine. I was just making
Do we
sure
do
how long we had.
you're doing osteo or scoliosis? It doesn't matter, actually.
Osteoporosis.
Oh, that's really nice. Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, no, and I can definitely help you, especially if you're on your own. If you guys you have quite anybody questions, reach out. I'm going through them now, but if you hit sort of a wall or it's new. It's new for a lot of us. It's new to make these things. So if you find yourself procrastinating a little much, talk to me. I'm here for you guys. I'm not okay. It's harder if the ones who haven't chosen anything, but I realize some of those are the same people who haven't taken tests too, so I'm not assuming everybody comes back. Yeah, Zuyata, 10 minutes is totally fine.
Okay, thank you. And I also sent you like the PowerPoint and
yeah,
the outline of what I might say.
Yeah, I will go through them. I haven't gotten to you guys yet. I'm at G, I think, in the G's.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Yeah, no, absolutely. Anybody else? Question? Comment? If not, then we move on. Of course, if you have something, just speak in and interrupt me. You don't have to wait for me to ask. The other thing, besides the questions and the lecture and the color labeling that we're doing and the presentation, is a gratitude journal. So there's this TED talk that I found, who is kind of funny, it's for 15 minutes, on happiness. He says, want to be happy, be grateful. And so it has been shown that, as humans, we as animals, we have to seek out danger in order to survive and not get eaten. But the problem is that also makes us look at the negative, because we need to correct it. And our society, we're pretty fairly well organized, and we don't have the lions on the side of the corner. We got those figured out. Well, now we have the cyber trucks that come after us, but that's different. But we often are a little extra anxious of things, and one way to reduce that is gratitude and focusing on the simple things like a beautiful sunset or a smell of a flower, and cherishing those moments is very, very therapeutic for the brain. That stupid stuff that we often think, but that's really, really helpful to bathe the brain in those thoughts, and it makes us more happy, and also more resilient, and more content. And so there's a lot of people who do gratitude journalings these days, or say we should, and I don't necessarily do it. But I would like us to do for 5 days, write down at the end of the day things that we appreciated that day. And I want to do, start with 5 things. It doesn't have to be excessive. It can be very simple. But reflect on it, and then also as you go through the day in this week, try to stop and smell the flowers a little extra. And then after the 5 days of doing that, we can sort of feel in, is that anything? We can practice it a little bit, and then can talk about it a little. And I'm doing this gratitude journal because it sort of helps. It's sort of an application of neuroplasticity, of using our brain. Because it's one thing to just have an anatomical discussion about this is part of the brain, this is part of the brain, but how do we use it, and what can we learn from it? And I think, the that gratitude thing is one thing that I can contribute to that using part. Yeah, I often thought these health kit things were not quite right, but I think they're okay to do, and a lot of them over the years have been getting fairly decent benefits from those. Like last semester, we did the gratitude journal, was right about when we had that Israel Gaza thing happening, and so that was really timely. And obviously, we're not much further on that, so it's a good time to do something like that. Does that make sense to how that works, or is that complicated?
No, seems easy.
Shouldn't be, right? It's easy.
Good. Yeah, I like it.
Good. Make me happy too. Now then, it shouldn't be too much of an effort. You just, reflect on it a few minutes a day, and then that's that part. Okay? Well, with that, any questions, any comments, anything else? Because I don't have anything else, I can let you go, and I go back to grading.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Good.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. M.
Thank you, guys. I'm only a text away.
Thank you.
Thank you. Reach out. Have a good one.
You too. Have a good day.
Bye.
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 Bye.